I had a really good debate in my last tier list video about why I don't rate movement as a particularly good controlling mechanic, so I thought I'd break down some of those arguments and present it in the video. Today I'm going to take a look at movement and destruction in more detail and give a rundown of what I believe the strengths and weaknesses of both are, before ultimately concluding that movement is only strong for short-term plays, and pretty much only on the turn that the base will break. So here we have our grid. I'll be returning to this periodically as I start to flesh it out. Let's start with the strength. Well, firstly, movement can allow you to break a base, utilising another player's power. And importantly, this means that they can only respond in your phase 3, rather than their phase 2, which is much harder to do, and a lot of factions simply don't have any way of playing cards during the base scoring phase. Just to give an example to make it really clear, as you can see I have 14 power on the Shark Reef base, and I need just 6 more power for the base to break. So I play Twister from my hand, which allows me to move a minion of power 3 or less from another base, so I'll move my opponent's Hammerhead minion on Wooden Horse to Shark Reef, which now, as you can see from the picture, puts the base on 20 power, so that it will now break this turn. This is definitely a strength, however the issue with this argument though is that it's only a strength if you'll break a base that turn with your opponent's power. Each game you're probably only breaking, between 4 and 6 bases on average before the game ends, so really there's only 4 to 6 turns where this can actually happen. The rest of the time you're moving a minion, but the minion remains in play because it has moved to a base not ready to score. This leads to my first two weaknesses with movement: factions with movement cards, and not removing strong in-play abilities. I looked at all of the factions in the game, not including Munchkin, and there are 27 factions that have movement cards, as well as 2 factions that I gave half points to in the Kitty Cats and the Penguins, which have 1 card that potentially lets you move your own minions. So we'll call it 28 factions out of a possible 66, that's 42.4% of factions that have at least 1 card that lets them move their own minions. If we add on to that there are 4 factions, only one of which, the Aliens, is already included in that previous figure, that let you return minions to hand and replay them, this is pseudo-movement. This brings it to 31 out of 66 factions in the game, which is almost 50% of factions that can potentially immediately counter your movement play if you don't remove the minion you move from play that turn. That is a lot of factions that can just simply counter move. The other weakness here is that unless you remove the minion you've moved from play that turn, you may just be leaving strong in-play abilities for your opponent. If I'm playing the Wizards and my opponent moves my Archmage from one base to another, and the Archmage is still in play when it comes around to my turn again, regardless of where the Archmage has ended up, I'm fine with that outcome, because the Archmage is more useful to me in play than it is scoring a base and leaving play. On the other hand, if my opponent destroys the Archmage on their turn, I've got no way of getting it back until I've gone through my deck and shuffled it back in again, which is a much worse outcome for me. So this ties back into what I've mentioned earlier on. Movement is only good on your turn where the play results in leveraging their minion for maximum effect. As soon as your turn ends, and if that minion's still around, well, the power of the play drops away enormously, because there's a good chance they can counter the movement or continue to use that minion's ability. This then leads into my next weakness, which is that movement doesn't actually stop your opponent from scoring victory points. This is huge, obviously. Smash Up is a game based on victory points. Moving your opponent's minions around isn't actually denying them victory points. You might be slowing the rate at which they're getting them, but by moving their minions away from bases you're targeting, you're giving your opponents a head start on other bases that it's likely they'll end up winning. Destruction on this is much cleaner. If your opponents don't have any minions, they can't score victory points and therefore they can't win. On a related point to help bring that point to life, if I'm playing Dinosaur Pirates and I can only ever play 1 minion a turn, and my opponent is playing a combo that can always move or always destroy 1 minion every turn just for simplicity's sake, against destruction I can only ever try and score 1 base, the base that I choose to play on that turn. With movement, I'm actually scoring multiple bases: the base that I choose to play on, I'm trying to score, and the base or bases that my opponent is moving my minions to. Just to try and make that as clear as possible, if I try and play my War Raptor on Machu Picchu and my opponent destroys it, I'm only trying to score Machu Picchu. If I try and play War Raptor on Machu Picchu and my opponent moves it to Workshop, I'm trying to score Machu Picchu and I'm actually scoring Workshop. So next turn I can try and play on Machu Picchu again, or onto Workshop, and both are a good outcome now. If I play on Machu Picchu and get moved to Workshop again, that's a good result. If I play in Workshop, that's also a good result because my power is building there. I should also now address bases, as that's likely to be a key counter-argument. Defenders of movement will no doubt say that you can move your opponent's minions to bases that are more unfavourable or reward less VP. Well, there's one quick point to note on that. Unless it's a mass movement mechanic, you're only likely to be moving 1 or 2 of your opponent's minions in a turn. You can't make them overpay that way because you're adding their power incrementally. They might be fine with that, or you might get the base close enough where they decide to play one of their own minions on it and break it anyway. And the bases that award less VP also tend to have lower breakpoints. You're not making them less efficient because you've moved a minion from a base that awards 5 VP to the winner that has a higher breakpoint, compared to a base that awards 3 VP to the winner with a lower breakpoint. The main point with bases though is that movement is incredibly dependent on the bases in play, and I'm not referring to base abilities here, I'll come back to those, I'm just simply referring to the VP spread on bases that are in play. Look at this example, if these are the bases in play, where do you move Mr. Grumpers? All the bases are exactly the same, there's no obvious bad base here. Wintersquashed can't be in play every single game, you are going to get instances where there just isn't a good target for movement. Destruction on the other hand, it doesn't matter what the other bases in play are from a VP standpoint, remember, because your opponents can't score on any of them. Coming to base abilities now, putting aside those bases that say minions here cannot be affected as that stops movement as well as destruction, there are 6 bases that let minions move in some way compared to 3 bases that counter destruction. So if your intention is to strand a minion somewhere, there are twice as many bases that can potentially allow that player to bring the minion back into play in effect. Obviously though, in the context of 150 bases in the game, this is obviously a very minor point. Finally, while this is a weakness, this is actually a strength compared to destruction, as there are some cards that shut off movement-based strategies. However, there are far more cards that can provide protection from destruction. So this one is a weakness, but it's less of a weakness compared to destruction. This doesn't include cards that offer universal protection. Destruction is also more prevalent in the game than movement, so it makes sense that those counters are also more prevalent. However, I wouldn't say that it feels impossible to play destruction because there are just too many cards that provide protection from it. We'll finish on a strength then for movement, which is that mass movement can be a really good way to make opponents significantly overpay in a very inefficient way for VP. The most extreme example of this would be, imagine that every base is 1 power away from scoring, and you have no minions in play in a 2-player game. On your turn you play Felicia Day onto one of those bases, and every minion gets moved there and you score second for just 1 minion, and your opponent wins, but they've committed almost everything they have to lock up just 3 VP for instance. Now this is incredibly strong, easily one of the strongest mechanics in the game, but there's only a handful of cards that can actually do anything like this. So it's rare, but it has to go down as a big strength for those factions that can do it. Let's finish the grid now with the remaining destruction strengths and weaknesses. I've already added some as I've talked about movement. For the outstanding strengths, I haven't talked about player count yet, as with 3 or 4 players it doesn't really matter. Most often you'll have to target one opponent with your movement or destruction effect, so you'll always play it in a way that hits the player who's furthest ahead of you, or closest to you in VP if you're winning. In 4 players, movement does get better, because you can move a minion onto a base where it can't achieve at least 3rd place, which is like pseudo-destruction. In 2 players though, destruction is significantly stronger than movement because the denial of victory points is much more impactful, and it's very oppressive to play against. Think back to the example for instance earlier, where you can only play 1 minion on a turn, and your opponent always has 1 movement or 1 destruction effect available. However, the flip side of that is that destruction is much slower. You're only relying on your own power to break bases, so they'll break much slower, and you're committing more for the upside of unanswered victory points. Finally, I talked about the number of factions that have movement cards. Minion recovery is much scarcer in the game than movement cards. I counted 14 factions that have some form of minion recovery, some of which are shuffling back into the deck, which isn't great. There are also 4 factions, Disco Dancers, Robots, Vampires, and Minions of Cthulhu, which had conditional minion recovery, so I'm scoring them a half point each. So we'll call it 16 of 66 factions, which is 24.2%, so just a quarter of factions that can recover their minions. So unlike movement, where almost half of factions can counter being moved, there are only a quarter that can recover minions if they're destroyed. To summarise, movement is good for those short-term plays where you can leverage your opponent's power for maximum impact, pretty much exclusively base breaking. Outside of that, I find movement to be incredibly lackluster and inferior to destruction, for all the reasons I outlined in the video. Do you agree or disagree with me? I know there's going to be some people who disagree with me, but that's absolutely fine. Let me know why. If you want to carry on the debate, please do. I can't think of anything I haven't already covered right now, so it's likely that I'll just reference back to the video. But with that being said, I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.